So will you please give your warmest greetings to the newest king of comedy, Rupert Pupkin.
Do you remember Robert De Niro? The face of American cinema. The man who defined intensity, discipline, and greatness. On screen, he was untouchable, a symbol of control and power. But behind closed doors, his private life told a far darker story, filled with control, silence, and explosive legal battles that stunned even Hollywood insiders. And even more shocking, many of these details only surfaced decades later, in cold court transcripts and sworn testimonies. How could one of the greatest actors of all time lose control of everything off camera? Rare photos, unseen moments, and untold truths will be revealed in this video. Watch until the end to understand why Robert De Niro remains both revered and deeply unsettling. Robert De Niro was born on August 17, 1943, in Manhattan, New York, into a world that looked cultured, refined, and quietly distant. His parents, Virginia Admiral and Robert De Niro Sr., were respected painters immersed in the intellectual art circles of Greenwich Village. Their apartment was filled with canvases, books, conversations about aesthetics and meaning, but not warmth. When De Niro was only 2 years old, his parents divorced, and a fracture left a silence that would shape him far more deeply than any later applause. His father, a gifted abstract expressionist who struggled with his own identity and inner conflicts, drifted in and out of his son's life. His mother, disciplined and fiercely independent, became the dominant presence, supportive, but emotionally reserved. Love was not expressed through affection. It was shown through structure, expectations, and distance. De Niro later described his childhood as quiet, almost isolated. He spoke little, observed more than he participated. He learned early that feelings were not to be displayed, they were to be controlled. Growing up in Little Italy, young De Niro was surrounded by noise, movement, and danger. Street violence was common. Authority was respected. Weakness was not. Locals nicknamed him Bobby Milk because of his pale complexion, a harmless nickname that nonetheless marked him as different, someone slightly out of place. Rather than fighting back, he withdrew. He watched. He studied faces, gestures, the subtle shifts in power between people. Without realizing it, he was already training himself. At the age of 10, De Niro appeared on stage for the first time, playing the Cowardly Lion in a school production of The Wizard of Oz. For the first time, he felt something unfamiliar, permission to express what he never could in real life. Fear, rage, vulnerability. On stage, these emotions were not punished, they were applauded. Acting did not free him emotionally. It gave him control over emotion, a crucial distinction that would define his entire career. He enrolled in the High School of Music and Art, later transferring to the Stella Adler Conservatory and studying under Lee Strasberg at the Actors Studio. While other students sought fame, De Niro sought disappearance. He did not want to be seen as himself. He wanted to become someone else entirely. His upbringing had taught him that identity was fragile, and safety came from discipline, silence, and mastery. Acting became a controlled environment where chaos could exist, but only under his command. This emotional restraint became his armor. Friends described him as polite, but unreachable. Teachers praised his focus, but noted his detachment. There were no stories of wild rebellion, no dramatic childhood breakdowns. Instead, there was something colder, a slow internal tightening. Feelings went inward, tension accumulated, control became survival. The seeds of his future contradictions were planted early. A boy raised in an artistic home, yet emotionally starved, surrounded by creativity, yet fearful of vulnerability, drawn to darkness, but obsessed with discipline. This was not a childhood that produced joy, it produced precision. Years later, audiences would celebrate De Niro's intensity, his ability to disappear into violent, broken, obsessive men. Few realized how much of that power came not from imagination, but from a lifetime spent learning how to lock emotion away, then release it only when absolutely necessary. And as his career began to rise, that same emotional architecture, silence, control, suppression, would propel him toward greatness, while quietly preparing the ground for conflicts that fame could no longer contain. By the late 1960s, Robert De Niro was not chasing fame. He was chasing precision. While other young actors look for visibility, he looked for erasure, the ability to disappear so completely that nothing of the original man remained. He trained obsessively at the actor's studio, absorbing the teachings of Lee Strasberg, while also drawing discipline and psychological focus from Stella Adler's methods. For De Niro, technique was not theory. It was survival. His early film roles were small, often overlooked. Greetings in 1968, Bloody Mama in 1970. Performances that hinted at intensity, but not yet greatness. Casting directors found him serious, quiet, difficult to read. Some mistook that for a lack of charisma. Others sensed something dangerous beneath the surface. A tension that never fully released. Everything changed when he met Martin Scorsese. Their first collaboration, Mean Streets in 1973, did not simply launch De Niro's career. It unlocked him. Scorsese saw what others missed. De Niro did not act rage, he stored it. He did not perform violence. He understood its rhythm. On set, De Niro was methodical, restrained, almost eerily calm. Then the camera rolled and something feral emerged. This was method acting taken to an extreme. For Taxi Driver, De Niro obtained a real cab driver's license and spent weeks driving through New York at night, absorbing the city's decay, listening, watching, memorizing faces. He lost weight. He isolated himself. He practiced speaking into mirrors, rehearsing Travis Bickle's thoughts until they felt inevitable rather than scripted. The now iconic "you talking to me" was not a line. It was a psychological leak. With Raging Bull, the process turned brutal. De Niro gained over 60 pounds to portray Jake LaMotta's decline, then stripped the weight away again. The transformation damaged his body, strained his health, and alarmed those around him. But he refused shortcuts. Pain, to him, was evidence of truth. If a role did not hurt, it was incomplete. Off camera, he remained distant. Colleagues described a man who arrived early, spoke little, observed everything. He did not socialize. He did not explain himself. Control was absolute. Every movement was planned. Every emotional release was scheduled, and only allowed when the camera demanded it. Audiences began to sense it. De Niro's performances did not feel dramatic. They felt invasive. Viewers were not watching characters unravel. They were being pulled into the unraveling itself. Awards followed. Respect followed. Fear followed. De Niro became known as an actor who would go anywhere, no matter the cost. But there was a price no script could contain. Living inside violent minds required a form of emotional locking, and unlocking that blurred boundaries. The same discipline that allowed De Niro to dominate the screen also trained him to suppress vulnerability completely. Feelings were tools. Control was non-negotiable. Relationships became secondary to mastery. As his reputation grew, so did the distance between the man and the world around him. Method acting gave him power. It also deepened his isolation. And while Hollywood celebrated the genius it saw on screen, few noticed how much pressure was building beneath that quiet exterior. The performances were becoming legendary. The silence was becoming heavier. And as fame arrived in full force, the gap between Robert De Niro the icon and Robert De Niro the man was about to widen beyond repair. By the mid-1970s, Robert De Niro was no longer an emerging talent. He was becoming a standard. With The Godfather Part 2 in 1974, he didn't just win an Academy Award. He redefined what cinematic authority looked like. His performance as young Vito Corleone was quiet, deliberate, and unervingly precise. He learned Sicilian. He studied gestures from archival footage. He spoke less than other actors, and commanded more attention than all of them combined. Hollywood crowned him without question. What followed was a run that felt unstoppable. Taxi Driver, Raging Bull, The Deer Hunter. Each role added another layer to myth. De Niro, the actor who never compromised, the one who transformed his body, his voice, his posture, his very presence. The press called him disciplined, fearless, the gold standard of seriousness in an industry addicted to excess. Publicly, he was almost invisible. No scandals, no wild interviews, no emotional outbursts. He rarely smiled for cameras. He answered questions briefly, sometimes evasively. In an era when stars were expected to sell themselves, De Niro refused. That refusal only elevated him further. Silence became part of the brand. Studios trusted him with their darkest material. Directors deferred to him. Younger actors studied him the way athletes study game film. His image solidified into something immovable, the ultimate professional, a man governed entirely by control. But control has a cost. Behind the carefully managed public persona, De Niro's private world grew increasingly compartmentalized. He did not bring work home. He brought intensity. Relationships were lived around the margins of his schedule, his routines, his need for order. Friends noticed patterns. The same restaurants, the same seats, the same silences. Any disruption was met with irritation. Any challenge to authority was not argued. It was shut down. As his fame peaked, the contrast sharpened. On screen, he played men unraveling, violent, jealous, obsessive figures consumed by power and paranoia. Off-screen, he presented the opposite, calm, controlled, restrained. But the boundary between performance and personality was thinner than anyone realized. The traits that made his characters terrifying were being rehearsed repeatedly, refined, normalized. Hollywood continued to reward him. Box office success followed critical acclaim. By the 1990s, De Niro was not just a legend. He was an institution, and institutions rarely invite scrutiny. They are assumed to be stable, reliable, above suspicion. Yet in private, the machinery of control was tightening. Legal structures, financial safeguards, emotional distance. Everything was accounted for. Everything had a rule. Everything had a consequence. To the public, Robert De Niro represented mastery. To those closest to him, he represented something harder to define, a man whose need for order left little room for unpredictability or mercy. The image was flawless. The pressure was invisible. And as the years passed, that pressure would find an outlet, not in performance, not on screen, but in a very different arena, one with transcripts instead of scripts, testimonies instead of applause, and consequences no amount of cinematic legacy could silence. For decades, Robert De Niro's private life existed behind an almost impenetrable wall. He gave few interviews. He revealed little emotion. He allowed no one outside a tight inner circle to see how power was exercised when cameras were gone. That silence, once admired as discipline, would later become the very thing that amplified the shock when court documents began to surface. The turning point did not arrive suddenly. It accumulated. Years of tightly managed relationships, rigid routines, and an unspoken hierarchy inside his personal world created a dynamic where control was expected, not negotiated. Those closest to De Niro would later describe a man who demanded order with absolute consistency. Schedules were fixed. Finances were monitored down to the smallest detail. Deviations were not discussed. They were corrected. His marriage, once portrayed as stable and private, slowly unraveled behind closed doors. What followed was not a quiet separation, but prolonged and increasingly public legal war. Financial disputes escalated into character assessments. Private emails became exhibits. Personal behavior was placed under forensic scrutiny. For the first time, De Niro was not shaping a narrative. He was trapped inside one. Court filings painted a portrait that clashed violently with his public image. Accusations emerged describing patterns of intimidation, explosive anger, and emotional volatility. Testimonies referenced outbursts that appeared sudden but carried the weight of long-suppressed tension. Language once reserved for fictional characters, controlling, obsessive, verbally aggressive, now appeared in sworn statements attached to his name. What made the revelations more unsettling was their tone. They were not sensational. They were procedural, cold, methodical. The words read like blueprints of a life governed by dominance rather than dialogue. This was not a celebrity meltdown captured by paparazzi. It was a slow dissection of power dynamics conducted in legal language. Financial control became a central theme. Disputes over spending, employment contracts, and compensation exposed how tightly De Niro monitored his environment. Former associates described feeling constantly evaluated, corrected, and diminished. Emails revealed a voice far harsher than the reserved public persona audiences recognized. The contrast was jarring. The man who spoke softly on screen now appeared forceful and uncompromising in private correspondence. Media coverage intensified. Headlines struggled to reconcile the legend with the allegations. Commentators were cautious, often framing the situation as complex or private. But the damage was already unfolding. The aura of untouchability cracked. For the first time in his career, De Niro could not retreat into silence without consequence. Silence itself was now interpreted. Photographs from court appearances told their own story. An aging icon seated beneath fluorescent lights, jaw clenched, expression unreadable. No costumes, no scripts, no applause. Just a man confronted with the public exposure of behaviors long hidden behind discipline and prestige. Supporters argued context. Critics pointed to patterns. The legal battle dragged on, draining time, energy, and reputation. What once would have remained rumor now lived permanently in records. De Niro's legendary control, the very trait that defined his career, was being examined as a liability rather than a virtue. And beneath it all was a deeper question that no verdict could fully answer. Had decades of emotional suppression and absolute authority created a pressure system that eventually turned inward, or had the signs always been there? Overlooked because greatness made people look away? As the courtroom doors closed and reopened again, one truth became impossible to ignore. The greatest performances of Robert De Niro's life had always revolved around men who believed control was strength until it destroyed them. And this time, there was no director to call cut. As the legal conflict surrounding Robert De Niro deepened, the narrative no longer belonged to interpretation or legacy. It belonged to documentation. Testimony followed testimony, each adding weight to a portrait that felt increasingly incompatible with the myth Hollywood had protected for decades. What emerged was not a caricature villainy, but something more unsettling, a pattern of behavior shaped by power, habit, and the absence of emotional restraint. Former employees described working environments defined by unpredictability. Anger, they claimed, arrived without warning and without proportional cause. Language used in private communications revealed contempt rather than frustration. Court records detail moments where De Niro allegedly reduced those around him to functions rather than people. Replaceable, subordinate, easily dismissed. In this world, loyalty was assumed. Dissent was punished. What shocked many observers was how closely these behaviors mirrored the characters that made him famous. Men obsessed with control. Men who interpreted disagreement as betrayal. Men who justified cruelty as necessity. For years, audiences believed that Niro was exposing these personalities from the outside. Now, critics questioned whether he had been rehearsing them. The courtroom stripped away the protective distance of cinema. There were no close-ups to soften perception, no music to guide emotion, only stark transcripts read aloud, their tone flat, their implications heavy. When confronted with the allegations, De Niro did not perform remorse. He remained composed, defensive, controlled. The same stillness that once signaled mastery now suggested rigidity. Public reaction fractured along generational lines. Younger audiences, less invested in preserving legacy, demanded accountability. Older admirers struggled to reconcile admiration with discomfort. Media outlets walked a careful line, emphasizing due process while acknowledging the undeniable erosion of De Niro's untouchable status. Yet the most damaging consequence was not reputational. It was psychological. The legal battles forced De Niro into exposure. For a man who built his life on compartmentalization, this was catastrophic. Private mechanisms of control were dismantled under public scrutiny. Every email, every financial decision, every outburst was frozen in time and replayed without context or escape. Even victories in court fell hollow. No ruling could restore the distance he once commanded. Silence no longer protected him. Control no longer commanded respect. The man who once disappeared into characters now found himself unable to disappear from his own reality. In the years that followed, De Niro's public appearances became rare and measured. Interviews avoided personal topics. Statements were carefully vetted. The legendary intensity remained, but it was tempered by caution rather than confidence. Power had shifted. The gaze was no longer his to command. What the courtroom ultimately revealed was not a contradiction, but a convergence. The discipline, suppression, and dominance that fueled De Niro's greatest performances had never been confined to art. They were part of the architecture of his life. For decades, success insulated him from consequence. When that insulation failed, the collapse was quiet, but irreversible. The myth of Robert De Niro did not shatter in a single scandal. It eroded through exposure, through documentation, through the slow realization that greatness on screen does not exempt anyone from accountability off it. And as the legal battles faded from headlines, one truth lingered in their wake. The most dangerous roles are not the ones an actor plays, but the ones he lives without an audience. After the courtroom lights dimmed and headlines moved on, Robert De Niro entered a phase that felt unfamiliar even to longtime observers. Not collapse, not redemption, silence, a deliberate retreat into measured appearances and carefully controlled public moments. For a man whose life had been built on command, of craft, of environment, of narrative, this withdrawal marked a profound shift. He did not offer emotional statements. There were no public apologies framed for absolution. No confessional interviews designed to reset his image. Instead, De Niro leaned into restraint. Interviews became rare and tightly focused on work. Personal questions were deflected or ignored. The message was subtle but firm. The private world would remain closed, even if its outlines had already been exposed. This silence was not passive. It was strategic. Years of method discipline had trained him to endure scrutiny without reaction. Where other figures might spiral, De Niro calcified. He returned to routine, to structure, to work. Films continued, though the roles often reflected age, authority, and distance rather than volatility. The intensity was still present, but it had cooled, less explosive, more watchful. Public perception adjusted slowly. Some saw dignity in his refusal to perform contrition. Others interpreted it as avoidance. What became clear was that the era of unquestioned reverence was over. Every appearance now carried context. Every performance was read against a backdrop of documented behavior. The separation between art and artist, once taken for granted, grew thinner. Privately, those close to him noted changes that were less visible to the public. Less spontaneity, more caution, fewer voices in the room. Control remained, but it was no longer expansive. It contracted. The architecture of his life tightened inward, as if minimizing exposure could restore equilibrium. This period did not deliver catharsis. There was no single moment of reckoning, no dramatic turn toward reconciliation. Instead, there was endurance, a quiet recalibration in which De Niro accepted that legacy, once fixed, could be revised but not erased. In cinema, he had mastered the art of transformation. In life, transformation proved slower, heavier, and far less forgiving. The silence that followed the storm was not emptiness. It was consequence. And in that quiet, a final question lingered. When the noise fades and control no longer guarantees protection, what remains of a man whose entire identity was built on mastery? In the years that followed, Robert De Niro's life settled into a slower, more contained rhythm. The relentless forward motion that once defined his career gave way to selectivity. Roles were chosen carefully. Public appearances were limited. The man who once dominated every frame now seemed more comfortable occupying the margins, present but no longer seeking command. Professionally, his legacy remained intact, but no longer untouchable. Film schools still studied his performances. Actors still cited him as a benchmark. Taxi Driver and Raging Bull remained pillars of American cinema. Yet the conversation surrounding his work had shifted. Where audiences once spoke only of genius, they now spoke of cost, of what it took to produce such intensity, and who absorbed the impact. De Niro's later roles often mirrored this recalibration. He portrayed figures of authority worn down by time, men defined by past power rather than present control. These performances carried a different weight, less ferocity, more gravity. It was as if the screen had become a place not for domination, but for reflection. Outside of film, his world grew smaller. He guarded privacy fiercely. Family life remained largely shielded from public view. shaped by the lessons of exposure and consequence. There were no grand statements about redemption, no overt attempts to reshape public opinion. De Niro seemed to understand something essential. That legacy is not corrected by explanation, but by time. Among critics and fans, the debate persisted. Some separated art from artists with ease, choosing to preserve the purity of his work. Others argued that understanding the man behind performances enriched rather than diminished their impact. His films, after all, had always explored power, violence, and moral fracture. Knowing that these themes extended beyond fiction forced a more uncomfortable, but perhaps more honest, engagement. In old age, De Niro became a paradox, a living monument whose foundations were no longer unquestioned, a legend still revered, but now viewed through a lens sharpened by accountability. He had not been erased. He had been contextualized. That may be the truest form of legacy, not myth preserved untouched, but truth acknowledged alongside achievement. Robert De Niro's contribution to cinema remains extraordinary, but exists now with footnote, a reminder that mastery in art does not grant immunity in life. And as time continues to move forward, his story stands as a quiet warning that control, when elevated above empathy, eventually turns inward. That silence can protect until it cannot, and that even the most disciplined performances cannot fully contain the complexities of the man behind them.